Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the day that you've given us, and we're thankful for the time we can spend in studying your word. Father, we pray that you will help us as we study it, that it will help motivate us to be more faithful servants of yours and to try to make a difference in the world that is around us. We pray for those who have suffered the loss of the hurricane. Father, help them to find their way to get things restored in their areas. Help us as a church to be able to reach into those communities, as many already have, to help to feed them and to take care of their needs at this moment. And Father, we pray for those who have lost loved ones, that you would help them and comfort them on this day and make sure they can come through this time. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Right as we were coming home on Thursday, my neighbor, I knew she was in the hospital, and her daughter-in-law pulls up the driveway to tell us that she had COVID and did not survive. And so they're having her funeral today. And then as we got home Thursday, I was watching some things on Facebook. My high school group, we kind of keep updated with things. And one of my best friends in high school he'd been having health problems. And Thursday morning, his daughter went to check on him. And he was sick. She tried to get him to go to the doctor, and he wouldn't do it. Thursday afternoon, she came home and found him. He hadn't survived, whatever it was. They think it was a heart attack. He hadn't survived at his funeral. So a lot of people dealing with loss. Just a lot of things going on in people's lives. Some of it COVID, but not all of it COVID. And so we know life is traveling on for people, and they're trying to struggle with those things. So let's remember them. Just kind of think about those people as you think about, look for opportunities to serve. With COVID, helping people is, we can still help, but a lot of it's porch drops and things like that to help people get what they need to get through this time in their lives. And all that, I had something planned. I think I'm going to stick to that, but it just makes you think. My friend, I told Susan a few weeks ago, I said, I need to get back up to Kentucky and see him. Need to see, the last time I went up, I was in and out. I preached at that church and then left just last week as I got there. And then came back home. But sometimes we put off things that we really don't need to be putting off. We need to be thinking about, there's a voice from upstairs. So we need to just, when we need to do something, we need to do it. I think it's one of those things, the kind of the message that I have as a result of what's going on is, if you got somebody you need to go see them. Especially family, especially friends. If you got somebody you need to go help them. Especially family and friends. Especially fellow church members. Because it's important that we help each other. We're not going to do it any other way. One of the ladies that was at the event with us is a woman I know through Zoom who lives in Fresno, California. And while we were there, she had been to an event 2 years ago and had a stroke, a pretty major stroke while she was there. She was able to attend this one without any real residual side effects from the stroke. But she keeps foster children. And one of those foster children, Thursday, as we're getting home, we noticed, watching things on Facebook, one of her foster children has had something happen on Thursday where they had taken the child from the school to the hospital. And there was all kind of very serious, life-threatening type things going on, was all she could say. And when they were done, the teenager was able to recover from whatever that was. But they had to take them somewhere else about 2 hours away so they can get help for the other things that caused, their issues they were dealing with in life. And she was like, I want to get home so quick, but I can't. And she's struggling and trying to work her way through that. And we all just said, hey, well, we will do what we can to help you. We hope you can get home safely. And she was able to get there, and the child got the help that he needed. So you just never know when things are going to happen and how they're going to happen, how they're going to play out. So we need to think about those things. But a few weeks ago, I was listening to something online, and it was an application to something that was not church related. But the fellow talked about things in the organization he was talking about how the organization needs to be bigger, it needs to be brighter, and it needs to be better. And I saw him this past week and talked to him for a few minutes, and I said, that's going to preach as a sermon somewhere. And I said, I'm going to use it as a Bible class this morning, and then I'll fine-tune it even more. into a sermon. And the idea of those three things really can affect us as a church. They should motivate us as a church. They should help us to understand what's our purpose. You know, there's a guy out there that speaks, his question that he always talks about is, what is your why? You need to discover your why. You need to discover what your purpose is. And I think with these three things, thinking about it being bigger, brighter, and better, we can look at a few passages during class today and try to help us to think about those things. Because when the church, you know, I use this kind of a soapbox thing and talk about what is the world afraid of? When they attack us as a church and tell us basically we need to have a coat, a smile, a seat, and shut up. When we start challenging things. The latest thing I saw was some Hollywood, you know, big shot, or big head, I'd call it more than big shot, is telling everybody to protest this new law in Texas that started up this week. They have a new abortion law. They can sense a heartbeat, no abortion. They're like, oh, you can't do that, otherwise. And we're like, so you support murder? Because that's what you're doing. If it was a grown adult, you wouldn't do that. Why are you doing that for a child that's in the world? And it just all this big stuff, and people are so scared about things. But when you look at the concept of us being bigger, and when the church grows, you see in the New Testament, when the church starts growing, that's when the church starts having problems. Well, it's not something new to just the church. When you go back into Exodus chapter 1, when they changed kings in Egypt, beginning in verse 8, he says, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. See, Joseph has basically saved the entire nation of Egypt. They would have literally starved to death had it not been for him. Telling them what the dreams of the Pharaoh were, telling them what to do to prepare for the 7 years of plenty so that they could have enough for the 7 years of famine. And if it hadn't been for him and his interpretation and for Pharaoh putting him in charge of that, the nation of Egypt would have been wiped out. They would just starve to death. But there comes a new king over Egypt, says in verse 8, he said to his people, look, the children of Israel, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. When he saw something growing bigger, his immediate reaction is, we have to stop this. Never mind, we owe our very existence to them, our very survival to them, and what they contributed to us for the last 14 years. He says, but if they get bigger, there's going to be a problem. And when we look at things that grow, things that are really just booming, growing, busting at the seams, the world gets scared of that. But we need to be bigger anyway, because that's what the world needs. The world needs people to stand up for what's right, to stand up for the truth. They need people to have enough integrity to make sure that those things happen. And when we don't, we shrink back, we become just like them. We just get absorbed back into the world where you can't tell the difference. In all the weeds, everything just bleeds. The same thing happens to Jesus when you get over and go to John chapter 7. It's interesting to me that you're only 7 chapters into John and talking about the life of Christ, and he's having struggles already. In verse 1 of John chapter 7, it says, after these things Jesus walked in Galilee. He did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. They want to kill Jesus. What's Jesus done? What has he really done? He's done more than nothing, hasn't he? What's he done? He's served people, hasn't he? He's helped people. He's healed people. He's helped to feed people. Just before this, not far before this, is where he feeds the 5,000. And you go from feeding 5,000 people to the Jewish leaders want to kill you. You're doing good. What's the contrast? When you look at the Jewish leadership of the day, what are they doing to feed the 5,000? Nothing. They're setting up rules, they're setting up things that they have to deal with, and telling them, you got to abide by these, or else. And when Jesus doesn't fit that, and Jesus starts, his popularity starts growing, and all of these things are going on, when you come on down into John chapter 7 and verse 25, he says, when Jesus starts preaching and teaching later in the previous verses of this, some of the people in Jerusalem, it says in verse 25, is this not he whom they seek to kill? Now they deny it. They're like, who's trying to kill you? But yet the people on the street knew that the Jewish leaders were trying to kill Jesus. Why? Who's become more popular amongst the common man? Jesus has. Who's become bigger? Because when you think about Jesus' background, what do you see? He grows up in Nazareth. What's his father do for a living? He's a carpenter. What's likely that Jesus did for a living before he begins his public ministry? He's a carpenter. What does he look like? A carpenter. Does he look like somebody that's going to turn the world upside down and have a following like that? No. But yet, what happens? You know, I have a real good friend that spoke at a big preacher summit one time, and his topic was, should a preacher wear a coat and tie in the pulpit all the time? And I thought, when I was talking to his dad about it, I said, what a strange topic to give somebody. Because this guy never wears a tie. I don't know if he's got neck issues. I don't know why. He enjoys preaching that way and does a great job. His dad told me, he said, out of all of the lessons that are put together on the CDs and DVDs and all this stuff you can get after the event, that's the one lesson that did not appear. They pulled it. Because he said, no. I go places and I speak and I lead singing sometimes. And I remember when I went to Gulfport, Mississippi, where Sonny and I went, I was, the year before, I led singing for their Sunday morning service. And I asked the preacher, and I always do it before I go, I said, should I wear a coat and tie? Sometimes it's expected. And I want to accommodate whatever's expected. And I think you should. He says, if you do, you'll be the only one here doing it, except for one man. And said, all he's going to wear is a tie. Now he'll have on blue jeans and his shirt, his button-down shirt, but said he was a military instructor and he cannot break the habit of wearing a tie. That's okay. I'm good with that. He says, matter of fact, he said, I won't wear a coat unless I'm wearing a polo shirt. He says, I wear a sports coat over that. And I thought, well, that fits the community. Sure enough, when I got there for Sunday morning and leading singing, the only person in the whole congregation that had on a tie was this joker when he was teaching the class. He looked like we accommodate the community that we're involved in. Sometimes we can hold a higher expectation of people than really we should by having an expectation that you've got to dress this way, you got to look this way, you got to act this way. That's the same thing they did with Jesus. Jesus didn't look like what they thought he should look like, and he didn't act like what they thought he should look like, and he sure enough didn't hang out with people they thought he ought to hang out with. I mean, they call him a friend of publicans and sinners. He's hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes. And so when you look at those things in his life, you see why they tried to kill him. And verse 26 is interesting to me in that same passage in John 7. It says, but look, he speaks boldly, and they say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is truly the Christ? Well, the Jewish leaders aren't challenging him in public. Why they want to kill him? Number one. Number two, maybe they believe he's the Christ. And that just sets them off. You know, they continue, they send men after him. In verse 32, it says the Pharisees and chief priests sent officers to take him. When those officers go to take him, they come back around and they come back in verse 45 and they say, why have you not brought him? The officer says, no man ever spoke like that. They want to get Jesus, but why are they want to get Jesus? Because Jesus has gotten bigger than they have. And so we can follow that example. When Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ, he's saying, Jesus got bigger, I can get bigger too. I can be bigger than my surroundings, I can increase, because when you look at the church, in Acts chapter 2, beginning there, It's interesting to me that you go from Acts chapter 2 and verse 41 says, there were added that day about 3,000 souls to them. You go from 120 people hanging out in the upper room who are scared to death, they're all going to die, to just 10 days or 40 days, 50 days later maybe, within that time frame, now there are 3,000 people who've decided they're going to follow Christ. You go down to Acts chapter 4 and verse 4, it says, many of those who heard the word believed, and the number of the men came to be about 5,000. So now you're at 8,000 people. And no telling how many in between that we're not given a number for. Chapter 5 and verse 14, it says the believers were increasingly added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women. Now you've got so many people becoming Christians you can't even count them. The church grows and gets bigger physically, but it's not just getting bigger physically, it's getting bigger spiritually as well, isn't it? Because just after this passage in Acts chapter 5, you see the big dispute over the Grecian widows not being taken care of, the benevolence that's not being handled, and then they decide a way to handle it. They get it handled. What's the immediate verse after that? And the church grew. They grew because they were together. They grew not just in number, but they're growing in closeness to one another, because when you go back up to Acts chapter 2, it talks about the church, people adding to the church daily, those being saved in verse 47, how they continued in each other's houses in the apostles' doctrine. They grew because they were together. They got bigger. And then what happens to them eventually, if you follow church history, what comes along later is there's an attempt by the Romans to eliminate the church. They're feeding them to animals for sport. They're burning them for lampstands and lights in the courtyards of the nobles as persecution to try to put a stop to it, because they're getting bigger. And they're equipped, because it's interesting to me that they're following the plan in Ephesians chapter 4, talks about God, or the Spirit gives some to be apostles, some prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry. He says in verse 14, so that they should no longer be children tossed to and fro. What happens if a child doesn't grow? What do we do? Going to the doctor, aren't we? Yeah. We're going to that doctor and we're saying, look, this child's not growing. What's the problem? We want to know what's happening if this child is not growing. What do we need to change? We came home the other day from Florida, and Dominic's car sitting in the yard, and crawling out under his car is 4 kittens. We knew we were born before we left. But they come out and they're crying, they're whining, they're hunting for us. They heard us and they come out. And we're like, well, where's the mom? We can't find her. So the next morning, I'm running down to the feed store to get some milk and little bitty bottles and all this stuff so we can bottle feed. But what we expect and we're seeing is little kittens are now growing. And they're sucking on that bottle and they're trying to do that. But if they didn't grow in a natural environment, we would be going to the vet. If I couldn't do something to help them grow, like go get them milk so I could feed them, that would be a problem, wouldn't it? With our children, it would be that way. It would be a problem in the church if we just continue to be children and childish about things that go on. I think it's interesting, sometimes we get hung up when we talk about the qualifications for elders in the church. And we get hung up on whether they have one child or a dozen. It's just, any number. And we ask ourselves, and I was down, I asked the question, why does an elder need to have children? What happens when adults start having problems? And how do they act? They act like kids. I taught a Bible class at some point one time, and a gentleman spoke up in the back, and he kind of had a little bit of a thrill in tormenting the teachers and see how they would react, I think. And when I was done, somebody came up to me and they said, well, you handled that very well. How did you manage that? And I said, taught teenage Bible classes most of my life. I said, no difference in teaching a class with a teenager. You know, in the workplace, we see that kind of thing going on. As I'm sitting at the desk one day in Tennessee, relieving for a manager, and I had a technician who, he really did take a sick thread and torment managers. I mean, it was a game he played. And he had gone out the door that morning and said, what are we going to do when we run out of work? We got this contractor. I said, well, I'll take his work and give it to you and send him home. Right. That's all we did. By noon, this guy was out of work and calls me. He'd never done that before. Calls me and he says, when you pick up the phone and you hear the voice on the other end says, Shepherd, what are we going to do? I just cringed. This other guy sitting beside me, and I know a little bit about his background. He's got a health issue, going to stay in office and help me. And when I'm done dealing with this guy, he's like, what am I going to do? And I said, well, Mike just hit the phone system with this Chevy dealer over in Lewisburg. I said, go over and see if you can get that thing back up. 3 days later, he got it restored. Lightning must have hit the building correctly to have the mess he found. He never called me again. But Mitchell sitting there next to me, Mitchell, when I hung up, he says, why did you handle that so calmly? I said, it's just like handling it with a kid. I said, but I was ready before he ever called. Right. In the church, this passage in Ephesians chapter 4, God gives us the tools we need to be ready so that we don't have to be like children tossed to and fro. He says we may grow up in verse 15. He says these things are there for the growth of the body. The church is expected to be bigger. The church is expected to be bigger because the church is supposed to have a bigger influence in the world than Satan does. And so, number one, the church, we need to be bigger. The next thing that I want to talk about this morning is thinking about the church needs to be brighter. I've got a leadership Bible that I use sometimes. When it goes to the passage in Matthew chapter 5, it has a lesson called Shake, Salt, and Shine Light. And I've used that for a devotion here before. When you get to Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, in verse 13, you are the salt of the earth, and if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's thenceforth good for nothing but to be thrown out, trampled under the foot of men. He says, you are the light of the world, a city that is set on the hill that cannot be hidden. Neither do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a light stand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. This one passage, when I look at it, and talk about the idea of us being brighter, of us being lights in the world and salt on the earth. Look at the things this light does. And I think the things that the light does and accomplishes are things that start small and they end big. Because you kind of go at it, and you got to jump around just a little bit to put this puzzle back together. He says in verse 15, he says that the light is the lamp is put on a lampstand to give light to everybody who's in the house. Where should we as Christians first be brightest? At home. Why? Why should we be brightest at home? When we look at what's going on in our society today, we track it backwards. We go from society as a whole out there, and we track it all the way backwards, like a funnel down to its point. Where do we find the problem? In the home, don't we? Yeah. We really do. When I first started going to Jamaica back in the mid-'80s, they had a gang, I won't call them a group, they were a gang of young boys that ran rampant through communities in the entire country, and they called them the fatherless. Because they were being raised by their mothers. Some of them raised by their grandmothers, some of them, they were fatherless. And everybody's like, what do we do? How did it happen? What happened? What's going on? They said, your name is telling you what the problem is. Fatherless. And the resulting violence was horrible. The Jamaican paper that I get emailed to me a couple times a week, they're supposed to do it every day, but it's Jamaica. But the Jamaican paper, I used to always buy it when I went there just to read and see what's going on. And the paper had multiple stories about somebody being found laying on the side of the road where somebody had taken a machete to them.
Yeah.
Constantly. Guns were illegal and they were very restrictive about, even the police departments didn't have them back then. Now the private security did, Patriot Gun and all these other people, but that other people didn't. When you start seeing problems in a society, when you start seeing problems in the church, really, when we did inner city work, one of the things we had to overcome, the things we had to accomplish was the fact that there weren't fathers in the home. The homes that many of these young people came from were homes that, to describe them, would just make you furious at the things that were going on in their homes. But if we're going to be a light, we're going to be brighter. We got to be brighter at home first. We start there, and then he says that let your light shine before men. I think really puts a cap on it. He says you are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. When we are a light in the home that we're supposed to be, we become a light to the world around us. And as a church, we become the light to the city that is around us, and they can't help but see it because we're brighter. We're brighter than the misery and despair that the world tries to tell people they need to be a part of. We're brighter than the negative influences of the news, of the TV shows, all of these things, and these people who claim themselves to be leaders in various communities, and yet they tell people you cannot succeed unless this group, the government, steps in and helps you. That's the most enslaving statement I've ever heard in my life. When we are the light of the world, when we are that city set on a hill that cannot be hidden, we are telling people, number one, you are valuable, because if you weren't, Jesus wouldn't have died for you. And we're here to try to help you with whatever we can. Can we help everybody? No. Because not everybody is ready for help at the time we cross their paths.
Gonna have some problems.
Gonna have problems. Why do we have problems? Because we got people. Jerry Barber wrote a series called Why We Have Problems in the Church. And I had to listen to back in the days, cassette tapes. I listened to it 3 or 4 times. Dad gave it to me, and I'm like, I gotta hear the answer to this question. He says, we're gonna have problems in the church as long as we've got people in the church. You wanna get rid of problems in the church, get rid of the people. Then, wait a minute, they don't have church. We're gonna deal with people. They're gonna be problems. But we are to let our light shine before men that they may see our good works and glorify the Father in heaven. We don't do our good works, and it's so hard sometimes when you talk to people who come to different things we do here. When we tell, they go, well, why are you doing this? Well, we just want to help. God has blessed us, and we want to bless you. Well, why are you doing that? And they keep asking that same question because it's hard to understand it. Why would you do that? Because we're trying to live the light of the world. We're trying to let our light shine, not to glorify us as individuals, not to glorify just Rock Creek, but to glorify God. Because when people can see Christ living in us, then we start to make a difference in their lives. So we can be bigger, and we can be brighter. Christians, in a little footnote I found in commentaries I read, talks about Christians in the church can diffuse light in 2 ways. One is by reflecting it. It talks about the light being set on the lampstand, giving light to everything in the house. And the other is by dispersing it, broadcasting it everywhere. You set a lamp, and somebody have probably seen these lamps. They're mostly oil burning lamps that have a reflector behind them.
Yeah.
They're meant to light up directionally away from the mantelpiece, probably that they were sitting on. But there are times when you take the reflector off and they set it in the middle of the table. Or camp stove light. We used to take those Coleman lamps.
Yeah.
Boy, that thing put off some serious amount of light. And you carried it, and it's open all the way around, so as you set it in the middle of the campsite, you lit the whole campsite. You could see the thing for yards. Seemed like for a mile sometimes, as bright as they were. But you could see those things because they were dispersing the light in there. And all we're doing is reflecting or dispersing the light that John 1 talks about the light of the world is Christ. It's really that simple. Christ is the light, and we're to reflect it. When we try to teach people and reach people, if we're doing anything more than trying to show them Christ, we're not reflecting the light of Christ, we're reflecting us. And we need to be sure that what we're doing is reflecting that true light. You know, he says in Philippians, Paul tells the Philippians, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. He says, we shine as lights in the world. We're different. And we should be different. And because the world says you're different and you're not like everybody else, you need to have a seat to the side and become more like everybody else. Even our own brethren are saying those kinds of things. We need to stand out because Jesus stood out. And we're supposed to be those. The last word, the last of the 3 B's to talk about is that we need to be better. It'll hit me in a second. Thank you. Excuse me. When you think about better, I really go to just one book of the Bible for that. I know there's a lot of things talked about being better in different places, but when you come to the book of Hebrews, when I looked up the word better, it appears in the New Testament about 35 times. 15 of those times, I believe it is, show up in the book of Hebrews alone, almost half of those times. And it comes in several concepts of things that are kind of strange and interesting to me, is we become so much better, verse 4 of Hebrews chapter 1, we become so much better than the angels, and as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they, talking about Jesus, and how the excellency and the betterness of his promises of being a part of Jesus is better than the angels. And we need to be taking advantage of that as well. He says, we are confident, Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 9, we are confident of better things concerning you, yes, things that accompany salvation, though we speak in this manner. He says in chapter 7 and verse 7, beyond our contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. The world that is around us, the world that is struggling, the world that is trying to accomplish whatever they need to accomplish to be better in life, they are blessed because we are better. And because we act like we're better. Not because I'm better than you. No, not that condescending form of better. That servant form of being better. And helping them in the things they do. He says Jesus has become a surety of a better covenant, verse 22. Verse 19, it's chapter 19. It's a better hope that we draw near to God. So we have a better hope. We have a better covenant. Jesus in chapter 8 and verse 6 says he's a mediator of a better covenant. Chapter 9 and verse 23, there are better sacrifices than those that were offered under the old law. Verse 34 of chapter 10 says we have a better and enduring possession for ourselves in heaven. He says they in chapter 11 verse 16, they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Because when you study the Old Testament, what's missing from the Old Testament that's present in the New? There's a promise of God's blessing. There's a promise if you're obedient to God, you'll be blessed, you'll be strengthened, all of those things are going on. But the one thing I see missing from the Old Testament that is in the New is the blessing of a heavenly reward of eternity. Now, I believe that people in the Old, and when you read the book of Hebrews, they inherited heaven as being faithful. I believe that's where it kind of brings all that, wraps it all together. But when you look at the promises that were made to them, and when you get to Hebrews chapter 12, I think it is, where he talks about the cloud of witnesses and how they didn't receive the promise toward the end of chapter 11. Yet they were faithful. They stayed faithful because it was better. It was the better way to be in their lives. And so we have a better resurrection, chapter 11 and verse 35. God's provided something for us in verse 40 of chapter 11 that is better for us that will be made perfect. And then he says in chapter 12 and verse 23, or 24, excuse me, he says, Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant into the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Because when you back up to chapter 10, it says it's impossible that the blood of bulls and goats would take away sins. It took the blood of Jesus to make that happen. So we, as Christians, are better. We have so much better than what the world has promised to us. And we need to be careful and be sure that the message that we present to the world is that they can be better too. You see, I used a story while I was doing some speaker stuff. Some of y'all helped me with it a little bit. I remember when I was 15 years old that a local preacher came by to pick me up, and we would go to Bible studies all the time. Remember Jewel Miller film strips? And you had the little record player, and as the record player played or the cassette tape played, there would be a beat, and you had to turn to the next slide. I was the guy who turned the slides. I went with Larry and watched him do this, and we do that. He comes and picks me up on a Saturday, and we go to he said, I asked him, I said, where are we going? He said, we're going to the county jail. And I was 15 years old at the time. It kind of freaked me out a little bit. I'd never been to a jail before. I said, well, why are we going to the jail? Larry says, well, we're going to visit a preacher who had reached out to him the week before who wanted us to come and visit with him while he was spending time in jail. Well, my 15-year-old mind is churning more questions and says, why, he's a preacher and he's in jail, why is he in jail? He said, well, because he's a flasher. It freaked me out. I'm like, a flasher? What are you talking about? Why are we going to go see this guy? Larry says, one, he asked us to, and two, Jesus says, go visit people in jail and minister to them. And so we get to the jail, and it's just a metal cage in this building in downtown Clinton, and all that's in there is a bed and a chair. And so we go in to sit down, and the two of them study for about 2 hours with each other. And I watch it and realize how normal this looks, just like any other study Larry is taking me to, where we sit at somebody's dining room table and study. When we're done, we get up to leave after a word of prayer, and I asked Larry on the way to the car, I said, do you really think what we've done here today has done any good? Is this guy going to change his life because of that, what we've done? He says, our job, our mission is simply to be the messenger. He said, the responsibility to change is this man's, and his alone, and there's nothing we can do to control that. And see, when I think about ministry over the last 47 years, I think about all the people that I've come in contact with and have to remind myself, number one, the outcome's not my responsibility. And number two, it is my responsibility to minister to them, to serve them wherever they are, to take them from where they are to where they want to be or where they need to be. See, that's the only thing we can do. But I learned that because somebody else in my life wanted to make sure I was bigger and better than them and brighter than them in reaching out to people who were lost. People who many times in society we just blow them off. Because John Gallagher told me one time when we talked to him about his jail ministry, he says, prisons and jails are full of good people. And I'm just going, what? He says, they're full of good people who've made bad decisions that made them do that. He says, we don't need to judge them, why they're there, any of those things, because they have enough of that. That's the judge's responsibility to take care of that. We as Christians need to minister to them. We need to reach out to them. We need to help them overcome whatever it is. Because you see, I don't have to be in a physical jail. I don't have to be in a metal cage to be in jail, do I? So being in jail over mine. We can be in that jail in our mind that makes us, that causes us to make bad decisions, or we're there because we have made bad decisions and we constantly think on those things. But yet, the writer of Hebrews says, things are better, and we are better because of them. So we need to be bigger. Number one, as we started out, we need to be brighter. And last of all, we need to be better because the world is relying on us to do it. Not to sit around and talk about doing it, but to do it. And to find those things. We can look back on things. One of the things I want to talk about, just don't have just a few minutes. What I want to challenge you to think about is the things we have done here at Rock Creek. When we think about being bigger, brighter, and better, can we do something else that makes us even bigger, brighter, and better? Can we change something we're doing to make it bigger, brighter, and better? Can we do things that help equip us better to challenge people who come to us struggling with whatever bad decisions they've made in their life to help them be bigger, brighter, and better? Because see, it's Christianity. The great thing about Christianity and the hardest thing about Christianity at the same time is we don't do this alone. And we can't go if we don't take someone else with us. We have to share what God has told us, what the message that God has given us with the world around us to help them go with us. And if we don't, we haven't fulfilled our life. We haven't done what God told us He wants us to do. Because there's a world to be changed. When He tells those apostles in Mark 16, Matthew 28, where we read, He says, go out into all the world. I like Matthew 28 where He says, and make disciples. Disciple making is not a microwave approach. It takes time. It takes interaction with people. It takes us learning more about them and less about ourselves and helping them